So here's the step pyramid again in Saqqara, just south of Giza. As I was saying, Kenneth Clark says this is where civilization began. With this we mark a great leap to an entire new level of human achievement. It's pretty much at the beginning of the history of serious building in stone, and it's so startling compared to its predecessors that it would hardly be more amazing if the Boeing 747 were the second plane built by the Wright brothers. This kind of achievement is an indication that a genius has been involved, and the genius who is thought to have put together the step pyramid for Zoser is a man named Imhotep, by reputation sort of the Leonardo of his day, though we know little about him for certain. This is a closer view of the step pyramid. I mentioned above that two of the requirements for civilization are the settled life made possible by farming and written language, which transformed the communication of ideas. I'd say that there's at least one more, the presence of genius. I don't want to get bogged down in linguistic analysis here, but there's a difference between being civilized, that is, being part of a settled community in which at least some people can write, and being part of a civilization. Nebraska is a civilized place, but it would sound odd to talk about Nebraskan civilization. To have a civilization, it's necessary to have outstanding accomplishment in the arts or sciences. Football, I'm afraid, doesn't count. And for that you need geniuses, people who are so different in ability from the rest of us that they just seem almost like they belong to another species. They are the ones who make civilized people into a civilization by reflection of their glory. Professor John Romer, in effect, agrees with Kenneth Clark about the primacy of the step pyramid and calls it the Homo erectus of our metabiological lives. Here we, or at least a genius or two among us, first, as it were, stood up mentally or psychically. The idea of what human beings could accomplish suddenly expanded to reach a whole new horizon. The step pyramid is evidence of well-organized, well-led people creating a monument that will last forever. It's tempting to think that some new technological breakthrough was responsible for this, some new kinds of tools, but there's no real evidence of this. It has to be explained, I think, as the result of a new attitude or perspective rather than as the result of a new technology. Was once enclosed by a wall a mile in circumference that also included a large complex of buildings connected with the cult of the deceased and producing the look of sort of a funereal mall. There is, of course, a lot of controversy over what pyramids were really for, but most of them at least look like they were intended for a burial, even if no body has ever actually been found in one. This, like most others, is solid, essentially filled with nothing but time, as someone has put it.
Below ground, however, a whole series of chambers and passageways has been discovered, including this one with an image of Pharaoh Zoser and decorated with faience ceramic tiles. This is the 90-foot deep shaft with the monumental sarcophagus below. Here it is up close. All that was left of, apparently, Zoser was a piece of his mummified foot.
If as an ancient mourner you wanted to pay your last respects to his late majesty, you would have come to the temple. Their ceremonies honoring the deceased apparently went on for some years or some centuries till no one cared anymore. Many of these buildings do look remarkably modern. Their style has been compared to Art Deco and to the fascist architecture of Europe in the 30s. In any case, they do look far more modern than many buildings built much closer to our own time. This is part of the temple interior now, which doesn't look so much modern, however, as Greek. These are called fasciculated columns because they have convex flutes rather than the concave ones the Greeks employ. But from a distance, they look almost alike, and in fact, these are the direct ancestors of the Parthenon columns. There's no doubt that as far as their visual art goes, the Greeks of the classic period owe far more to Egypt than to Mycenae, Knossos, and Troy combined. Kenneth Clark says the ancient Egyptians cut stone as well as it ever would be cut. Other stone carvers to come may have worked in different styles, different media, but certainly no one has ever been able to do so much with so little in the way of tools, no less than the Greeks. What they wanted to do, the ancient Egyptians, with stone, they could do with it. The Egyptians of Zoser's day had little metal, and yet cut stones as square and regular as if they'd been precast in a factory. The cobras you see here are symbols of Lower Egypt, often paired with vultures for Upper Egypt. Likewise, the bee is often identified with Lower Egypt, the sedge with Upper Egypt, the papyrus with Lower, the lotus with Upper Egypt. The first pharaoh of the 4th dynasty was Snofru, who's associated with the next 3 large pyramids built in the mid-26th century BC. The first one at Meidum is about 100 miles south of Cairo, about as far south as pyramids were ever built. This was, for a short time, the first straight-sided pyramid, but something bad happened to it. It apparently crashed down in a spectacular way before or soon after it was finished. It was originally over 300 feet high and is now some 140 feet above the surrounding rubble of itself. Here you see a closer view of it. According to Kurt Mendelsohn in his book, The Riddle of the Pyramids, this was originally built with sloping sides at the same angle, sloping up at the same angle as that which would be used by the architects of the Great Pyramid 50 years later. Unfortunately, this was just too ambitious a project for Snofru's people, and what was transiently the largest thing ever built became, in a matter of minutes, one of the most conspicuous engineering failures in history. Mendelsohn, in fact, calls it the most impressive ruin in the world, but that's because he's lost perspective from studying it too long. If Mendelsohn is correct, perhaps even before the Meidum Pyramid had been finished, another was begun by Snofru at Dashur just south of Saqqara. It was begun at an angle even steeper than the angle at Meidum. But just as the project had arrived at this level where you see the arrow, a loud kaboom was heard from up the Nile. The Meidum Pyramid had collapsed, and the builders at Dashur decided that discretion was the better part of architecture and immediately scaled back from 54 to 43 degrees. There are some problems with this theory. It seems odd, for example, that the collapse at Meidum seems to have occurred just when the builders at Dashur were exactly half finished, though of course the design here could have been altered somewhat to give the finished pyramid some symmetry. Also, independently of questions about its appearance, one has to wonder if the Meidum Pyramid was to have been Snofru's tombstone, what was the bent pyramid for? And the story doesn't end here either. Just a short distance from the bent pyramid, Snofru had yet a third pyramid built, the so-called Red Pyramid. This still stands as the earliest pyramid to achieve the straight-sided profile, but at the less spectacular angle of 43 degrees used for the top half of the bent pyramid. Mendelsohn says that this angle was chosen because of its successful use there. So Snofru, who, as Mendelsohn I think puts it, may never have been altogether satisfied with his contractors, wound up with 3 pyramids, and the distinction of having piled more stones on top of one another than any man in history, far exceeding in terms of total mass the much more celebrated accomplishment of his son in the Great Pyramid. Was Snofru just trying to get it right? No other pharaoh has even 2 pyramids, so that's a possible explanation at least, and no obviously better one has yet been proposed. Of course, not everyone got to be buried underneath a pyramid. Before the building of the step pyramid, pharaohs were typically buried in mastabas like this one, and after the pharaohs bought the pyramid idea, the noble class went on using these mastabas as tombs right through the pyramid age and beyond. When new, a mastaba looked like a very low, truncated pyramid, sort of like one step of the step pyramid. Most of them now give the impression that they were virtually built underground because they've been buried in the sand of the millennia. They are, however, very important because the pyramids have essentially no pictorial decoration in them, and the few surviving ruins of Old Kingdom temple complexes have yielded little more. The painting of the Old Kingdom period, and to a large extent the whole history of ancient Egyptian civilization, comes from the tombs of the nobles like this one of Ptahhotep. It's odd to think that virtually nothing that survives of Egyptian Old Kingdom painting, and not much more of its sculpture, was ever meant to be seen again. This comes from the mastaba tomb of Zoser's vizier, Hesare, and it's one of the earliest surviving works of wooden art. About a dozen of these plaques, about 4 feet high, were found, several in good condition. Someone has said that the desert creates nothing but preserves everything, and the climate of Egypt certainly does help account for the survival of things like this. It's interesting that Hesare is shown with his staffs of office and also his writing equipment. His case for his papyrus pens and brushes is hanging over his shoulder there at the left, and those two things that look sort of like big scored pills are hard ink tablets, sort of like the praying watercolors you used when you were in kindergarten. The Egyptians are shown in their art with writing material more often than any other ancient people. Based on surviving art, we'd have to judge that even the Greeks couldn't write at all. This, I think, says a lot for the respect with which the Egyptians regarded the miracle of the written word. It's now argued, in fact, that the oldest examples of writing may well come from Egypt rather than Mesopotamia. Not many Egyptians could, of course, read and write, and that's just as well, maybe. If everyone had to learn to read and write hieroglyphics, they probably wouldn't have had time to build the pyramids. We've already come about 500 years in the history of Egyptian art, and there's been little change in style from Narmer to this. That's like European art undergoing essentially no change from the Renaissance to the 20th century, from Michelangelo to Andy Warhol. This underlines, I think, what I said earlier about the conservative nature of Egyptian civilization. Despite the impressiveness of the collection in the Egyptian Museum, the finest Egyptian painting, to a large extent the sculpture, is still on the walls of the tombs where it's always been. And that certainly adds to its evocative power. Seeing a fragment of Egyptian art mounted on a beige wall in LA isn't quite the same thing. A lot of Egyptian sculpture like this in the mastaba tomb of Ptahhotep is done in what is sometimes called the steamroller style, because it really does just look like the figures have been flattened by something. And this, of course, is a representative of the same kind of style that we saw in the Narmer palette, that low relief that goes all the way back to the very origins of Egyptian sculpture. Now, an obvious question to ask here is this. If these were tombs never to be seen again, why were the walls so heavily decorated? No other civilization has ever put so much art where it was meant to be invisible. No other civilization has spent so much effort on decorating tombs. The Tomb of Tea, which is one of the most impressive at Saqqara, has this memorable scene on one of its walls. Now, the traditional explanation for this kind of decoration goes that the deceased was expecting to make use of the things depicted in the next life. But that's never seemed very convincing to me. The representations are just not systematic enough. If I thought my access to stuff in the next life was going to be limited by what was on the wall of my tomb, there'd be no blank spots. I'd want the walls of my tomb to look more like Kmart than like an art gallery. Some think there was a more spiritual than practical purpose involved. The so-called Symbolist View holds that the images were meant to convey truths or concepts of some kind. This harvest scene might, say, be making the point that as ye sow, so shall ye reap, for example. This purpose might seem to help explain some of the pictures, but it's difficult to apply it to most of the overall schemes in a persuasive way. Here again you are in the Tomb of Tea, out hunting hippopotamus. To me, the most acceptable explanation goes that the primary purpose of these paintings and reliefs was just to give the deceased a pleasant place in which to spend eternity. Given that being dead's no fun, it's at least nice to think of being surrounded in some sense by the images of things that were important or pleasant in this life, and to be depicted among them doing the things one liked to do, like hunt hippopotamus. I'm reminded of the fellow in Texas who was buried in his Cadillac. I don't think he really thought he was going to drive that through the pearly gates. It was just pleasant to imagine spending eternity in this car in which he'd probably had some good times, rather than in a damp coffin without even any chrome fins on it. One can argue that all these purposes are involved, but I'm inclined to think that the dominant one is just the decorative. We like being surrounded even in death by beautiful or evocative things. I must admit though, as I said, most other civilizations have given far less attention to this kind of thing than the Egyptians. The traditional or the you can take it with you theory and the symbolist theory have their problems, but it's not easy to claim, as those who back the decorative theory pretty much do, that what we see in Egyptian tombs is the manifestation of some sort of basic human desire or instinct to furnish the departed with mementos and beauty. The Egyptians and the Texan in his Cadillac are more exceptions than the rule for most of the history of civilization. One of the most often reproduced examples of ancient Egyptian art comes from the tomb of Snofru's son Nefermat at Meidum. Art like this at least doesn't seem prima facie spiritual or profound especially, but it is nice. In fact, I don't think you're going to see any painting that's more immediately likable than Egyptian tomb painting until we get to the Renaissance. Hardly any Mesopotamian or Greek painting survives. Some nice Roman painting does, but it's not clearly nicer than this, and only specialists like the wall painting of the Christian Middle Ages very much. Kenneth Clark says that from ancient Egyptian art to Leonardo da Vinci, painting was thought of primarily as the filling in of outlines. That might be a little hard to defend, but it's an interesting point we'll occasionally come back to. Another of Snofru's sons, Rahotep, was also buried at Meidum, and his tomb had these figures of himself and his wife in it. I mentioned earlier how modern the temple complex at the Step Pyramid looks, and Rahotep here looks equally modern, with his well-groomed little mustache, his Ivy League haircut, gold chain, suntan. He looks like he could have just stepped out of the pool at the Miami Hilton. And his wife, Nofret, is even more remarkable. This is the first image of a named woman in the history of art. There are images of women, of course, going all the way back to the Stone Age, like the ugly, faceless, fat little Willendorf Venus only desperate anthropologists could call a work of art. But this is no primitive fertility doll. This is a great work of art by any standard. This is where the history of women in art begins, and it's a stunning beginning. The Egyptians, in fact, probably depict women more in their art, at least individual identified women, than any other people of antiquity. One would have to judge from looking at any, say, Mesopotamian art that the ancient Assyrians were autogenetic. There's hardly a woman to be found in any surviving work, let alone a named person. There are female figures in Greek art, but very few are portraits of actual women. Not even the Romans depict real women more often than the Egyptians. Snofru's wife, Hetepheres, was also originally buried at Meidum, but her body and her tomb furniture were moved, perhaps by Khufu, though he was apparently Snofru's son by another wife, to Giza. And that's where they were found in 1925. Here you can see now in the Egyptian Museum the oldest real furniture in the history of furniture. Extensively restored, however. The chair has one of the oldest symbols representing the unity of Egypt on it, the papyrus intertwined with the lotus, or blue water lily. The bed doesn't look very comfortable, but this kind of bed is sometimes depicted with a mattress-like thing on it. Still, it looks like it would be hard to get a good night's sleep on that headrest. It's been suggested that that kind of thing was used to keep elaborate hairdos from getting messed up, which makes sense. This would all have received much more acclaim as you look at the Queen's sedan chair here now. If the discovery hadn't come just after the opening of King Tut's tomb, which put everything else Egyptian in its shadow for a long time, Queen Hetepheres' stuff is, however, 1,000 years older than King Tut's. I should say just a word about music at some point in this lecture, I think. There is very little original music available for a lecture series on ancient civilization. In a few weeks, we'll hear about a very scholarly attempt to reconstruct a piece of ancient music from Ugarit. But apart from that, and a few fragments of Greek and Roman music, the whole ancient world is as silent as its tombs. The virtually complete loss of the music of the ancient world is all the more serious because we know what an important role it played. From the many surviving pictures of instruments, we can, however, get some idea of what the music sounded like in the most general way. Professor Michael Atherton, in collaboration with the Australian Museum in Sydney, has done a lot of work making replicas of ancient Egyptian instruments, as well as researching which instruments in use today bear some resemblance to ancient ones. And we've been hearing some of them in this lecture. You're hearing now what was probably one of the commonest musical sounds of the ancient world. The instrument you're hearing is an Arabian argul, likely very similar in sound to instruments played throughout the ancient Near East and in Greece and Rome. Now, the most famous son of Snofru and Hetepheres is Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid. Out in the middle of the desert there at Giza, it's a little hard to get perspective on its size, so I've positioned it where you can get a better idea of this. The Golden Gate Bridge is 750 feet high, the Great Pyramid now around 450 feet high. Here it is again next to the Transamerica Pyramid in downtown San Francisco. The view more or less from Alcatraz. The Transamerica Pyramid is 850 feet high. And this is the way it actually looks now at Giza. It's the one on the right with its two successors beside it. You can see in this picture, although the telephoto lens exaggerates a little bit, how close Cairo is coming to the pyramids, and there's a good deal of concern about that. Amazing as it may seem, there are no straightforward references to the Great Pyramid in Egyptian literature for 2,000 years. Even though it's the biggest man-made thing till Hoover Dam. The Great Wall, erected thousands of years later, may contain more mass, but like Hoover Dam, it belongs more to the history of labor than the history of art anyway. The first fellow to write about it, whose work survives, is Herodotus, and we'll hear what he had to say and go on from there in the next lecture.